Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time this story reaches you. We like to know which corners of the world still listen when the old histories wake. It was the spring of 1852 in Calhoun County, Georgia. 2,000 acres of cotton shimmered like trapped clouds across the land. The Bogard plantation, Willow Creek, stood on a low hill, proud and pale beneath the southern sun. It was a kingdom of habits and silence, where wealth and cruelty lived side by side. Thomas Bogard ruled it with the ease of a man born to command. His wife, Eleanora Bogard, ruled herself, graceful, precise, and broken by 3 miscarriages. The house whispered about her behind closed doors, the fragile mistress who prayed for a child God never sent. On an evening heavy with the scent of wet magnolia, she walked into her husband's study without knocking, a small rebellion that froze the air. Thomas sat with his bourbon and ledger books, the ceiling fan whining overhead. "There's something in the east field," she said. He didn't look up. "A vagrant, probably. I'll have Jackson check the fence." She gripped her handkerchief so tightly it trembled in her hand. "He looked at me, Thomas. He knew me. That night she didn't sleep. By dawn," she'd written in her diary, "I saw him again. He never moves, only watches." Over the next 6 weeks, she would see the same figure 8 times, standing at the old well under the willow by the creek, at the iron gate of the family cemetery, where 3 generations of Bogards lay buried. Tall, still, eyes that caught moonlight and refused to give it back. Thomas laughed off each story, as imagination bred by heat and grief. But Sarah, the housemaid who had served Eleanora since childhood, noticed something else first, the quiet roundness in her mistress's belly. When Eleanora finally told Sarah she was with child, she did so not with joy but with a cold fear. "Promise me you won't tell him yet," she said. The joy that should have filled the house never came. She spent hours in the unused nursery, rocking slowly, staring through the window toward the east field. Sometimes she spoke to empty corners, as if someone stood there listening. When Thomas learned of the pregnancy, he wrote in his ledger that he was grateful and afraid in equal measure. Dr. Williams examined her and declared her health miraculous, advising tea and rest for her nervous fancies. But one night, while Sarah helped her change for bed, Eleanora whispered a sentence that Sarah would never repeat until old age. "This child isn't growing inside me," she said. "I'm growing inside it." By August, her body had expanded faster than any doctor would believe possible. She refused mirrors. She locked her door at night. Sometimes Sarah found her standing motionless in the hall, eyes tracking something moving in the air that no one else could see. Thomas moved to a guest room. He began to write letters to specialists in Augusta and Charleston about his wife's decline. He stopped looking at her directly. The storm that broke that September came without warning. Lightning split the sky like cracks in a black mirror. The servants hid in the basement. Thomas drank in his study. Then the screams came from upstairs, long and raw until they turned into a silence too deep for comfort. Sarah ran to the bedroom and found her mistress staring through the window, the rain on the glass flashing like signal fire. Outside, the figure stood again in the lightning, tall, still, waiting. When Sarah turned back, the child was already here. The birth was too fast, too easy. Thomas entered only when he heard the infant cry. He saw Eleanora cradling a baby whose eyes did not look like hers or his. Amber, vertical pupils, a color that didn't belong on land. He asked her quietly, "Who is the father of this child?" Eleanora looked at him and answered, "He was watching us from the fields. Now he no longer needs to wait." That was the night Willow Creek changed forever. The days after the birth passed like a fevered dream. The storm had stripped the trees bare, and the fields around Willow Creek glistened with rainwater and broken branches. Inside the house, the air felt wrong, thick, metallic, like something old had started breathing again beneath the floorboards. The servants moved quietly, avoiding the nursery. They whispered that the baby never cried. Not once, not when hungry, not when left alone. Sarah tried to feed him one morning, and froze when she saw his eyes following her hand before she even moved. The baby watched everything. Not like a child. Like something studying. Measuring. Dr. Williams arrived late the next day. The roads were flooded, and his carriage wheels had sunk deep into the red Georgia mud. He washed his hands with shaking fingers before examining the infant. "Healthy," he said after a long pause. "Exceptionally so. But in his notes, later found sealed inside a courthouse wall, he wrote something very different. Ocular anomaly of unknown type. Pupil vertical, amber hue. Subject appears alert beyond normal parameters. Thomas spent most nights drinking in his study, unable to look at his son. In letters to his brother in Charleston, he wrote of the thing in the cradle, and of Eleanora, who no longer seemed entirely human in her quiet devotion. She refused a wet nurse, fed the child herself, and rarely slept. When she did, she dreamt aloud, strange words in a language no one recognized. One night Sarah entered the room to find Eleanora awake and humming. The sound was low and rhythmic, almost like waves. The baby's eyes moved with the sound, pupils narrowing and widening with each hum. When Sarah asked what she was singing, Eleanora smiled faintly and said, "He remembers it. It's how they call to him." By October, Thomas could no longer bear it. He avoided the nursery altogether, retreating to the barn or the distant fields, just to breathe air that didn't smell of milk and salt. When he was home, he refused to speak the child's name. He had already written a new will excluding James entirely. The nights grew colder. The house grew quieter. Eleanora began walking the property before dawn, barefoot, the infant in her arms. She traced the same path every morning, from the house to the east field, then to the family cemetery, and finally back to the front porch. When Sarah asked why, Eleanora answered, "He must know where he came from, and where he'll go back." Dr. Williams continued his visits through November. He noted that the child's growth was unnaturally rapid. At 3 months, James could already sit upright. At times, when the doctor leaned close, the infant's skin seemed faintly luminous in the dark. He didn't mention this to Thomas. Not yet. By December, the Bogard home was a house of shadows. Thomas slept with a pistol under his pillow. Eleanora wrote in her diary that the voices come easier now. She recorded the phases of the moon beside her entries, marking nights when the tide was high and the baby's eyes glowed brightest. On one of those nights, Sarah woke to the sound of Eleanora singing again, but this time the words were clear enough to understand. She wasn't singing to the baby. She was singing with him. 2 voices, one human, one impossibly small, carrying the same melody like an echo through deep water. When Thomas heard it from the hallway, he froze. For a moment he thought he could hear something else underneath, the faint crash of distant waves, though the sea was hundreds of miles away. He didn't go inside. He turned away, back down the stairs, and poured himself another drink. The next morning he told the overseer he was sending his wife and child to the coastal house near Brunswick. For her health, he said. For his sanity, he meant. Eleanora didn't protest. She simply smiled that same knowing smile and whispered, "They'll find us there. The sea always keeps its promises." The move to Brunswick happened 3 days before Christmas. The air had turned sharp, the fields grey with frost. Eleanora refused the carriage's curtains. She wanted the wind on her face, the smell of the salt marshes as they drew closer to the coast. The infant lay silent in her arms, wide awake the entire journey. He did not cry. He did not blink. Thomas stood on the porch of Willow Creek, watching the wagon vanish down the red road until it was nothing but dust. That night, he wrote his brother a final letter. "I have sent them away," he said. "Perhaps the sea will take what the land should never have borne." He sealed the envelope, poured himself another bourbon, and did not sleep until the horizon turned grey. The Brunswick property was smaller, older, a weather-beaten house half swallowed by dunes. The windows rattled in the wind. The servants who accompanied her whispered about the smell of brine inside, as if the ocean had already claimed the walls. Eleanora took the upper bedroom facing the water. The baby's cradle was set near the window, where the tide could be heard at night. The days passed in uneasy calm. Sarah noticed that the child, James, as Eleanora still insisted on calling him, grew faster than any infant she had ever seen. By the end of January, his legs were strong enough to push himself upright. His eyes followed the waves with unblinking attention. At times, Sarah swore the boy hummed softly when the tide changed, his voice blending with the sea's rhythm. Eleanora stopped wearing shoes. She spent her night standing in the shallows at the edge of the beach, the baby in her arms, her gown clinging wet to her legs. When Sarah begged her to come inside, Eleanora only said, "It's teaching him the way back." Thomas, meanwhile, remained at Willow Creek, writing letters no one would ever answer. He told himself he had done what any rational man would, protected his estate, his name, his sanity. But the house didn't let him forget. Servants said he talked to himself. Others swore they heard dripping water in the halls, though it hadn't rained in weeks. The fire began in the dead of night. A storm was rising off the coast, wind driving the tide higher with each hour. The first to see the flames was a fisherman on the bluff. He said it looked as though the sea itself had lit the house from below. By the time neighbors reached the property, it was too late. The roof had collapsed, flames roaring bright against the black water. 2 bodies were recovered the next morning, Sarah and another servant, their faces unrecognizable, their hands burned as if they'd tried to dig their way out. Of Eleanora and her child there was nothing, no remains. No footprints in the sand, only the smell of salt and smoke. A third servant, Mary, was found wandering the beach hours later, her hair tangled with seaweed, her dress soaked to the waist. The sheriff tried to question her, but her answers made less sense each time she spoke. They came for him, she said, just like she said they would. Men out of the water walking on the waves. Their eyes shone like his. She gave the baby to them, and they spoke in words that hurt to hear. When asked who they were, Mary whispered, "Not men, not anymore." Then she began to laugh until she screamed. The official report called it a tragic accident, fire caused by lightning or carelessness. The bodies lost to the surf. But the sheriff's deputy, who helped pull wreckage from the ruins later, told his wife something he never wrote down. He said that when the tide went out, there were marks in the wet sand leading from the house to the ocean. Not footprints, something wider like the sweep of tails or fins dragging through the surf. When Thomas received the telegram, he collapsed in his study. For 3 days he neither ate nor spoke. On the 4th, he rose from bed and gave an order. The Brunswick house was to be razed to the ground, every stone hauled away, the land sold. He swore no Bogard would ever set foot on that beach again, but some nights, when the wind carried the smell of the sea inland, the servants heard him pacing the upstairs hall, muttering one phrase over and over again. She said he was watching us. Now he's watching me. Thomas Bogard never returned to the coast. After the fire at Brunswick, he shut himself inside Willow Creek and sealed the shutters. For a month, the house remained silent except for the footsteps that crossed the upper hall at midnight, footsteps the servants swore did not belong to him. He ate little, drank too much, slept not at all. When the doctor visited, Thomas would only say one thing: she went back to them. No one asked what he meant. By spring of 1853, Willow Creek had begun to decay from the inside. Paint peeled in strips from the parlor walls. The smell of the fields changed, wet, metallic like rust on a blade. Livestock refused to drink from the eastern pond. The workers said the soil near the far fence turned black, even when the rest of the land stayed bright with cotton. That summer, Thomas dismissed nearly half his staff and began sleeping during the day, walking the property at night. Sometimes the overseer found him standing at the eastern boundary, facing the tree line where the ground sank into low marsh. When asked what he was doing, Thomas said quietly, "Listening." In late autumn, the lawyer from Edison arrived to finalize a sale. Thomas had decided to leave Georgia entirely. He was pale, thin, and soft-spoken, the voice of a man who had spent too long speaking only to ghosts. He sold everything, the house, the land, the workers, everything except the eastern boundary. That strip of land, a narrow corridor of overgrown brush leading toward the old creek, he refused to sell. He set aside a trust to build and maintain a stone wall there for all generations. No one understood why. The clause was signed, notarized, and sealed in Baltimore when he left Georgia for good. He never married again. He died in 1877, and his will donated his fortune to schools and churches, with one strange instruction, that the wall at Willow Creek was never to be taken down, and that it must be inspected after every full moon in September. No explanation, no context, just that. More than a century later, in 1961, researchers from Atlanta University stumbled upon the Bogard records while compiling data on plantation life. Their leader, Dr. Marcus Wilson, a professor of historical anthropology, became fascinated with the contradictions in the archives, the sudden will change, the coastal fire, the odd maintenance trust for a wall in the middle of a pine forest. He visited Calhoun County himself that fall. The original plantation house was gone, replaced by flat farmland and scattered ruins, but the wall still stood, 6 feet high, 2 feet thick, built of local granite. Moss crept along its base. No one could say who repaired it after storms. The farmers just said, "That's the Bogard wall. The bank pays for it. Always has." Wilson's field notes described an oppressive atmosphere. He wrote that the birds avoided the area, that the air near the wall smelled faintly of salt, though the ocean was more than 100 miles away. On the night of September 15, 1961, the anniversary of James Bogard's birth, Wilson returned alone. The moon was full, bright enough to turn the field silver. At 11:30 p.m., he recorded a strange sensation, a change in pressure like the deep pull of tidewater. Then he saw it, a figure or perhaps a shadow standing beyond the wall in the field. It did not move, but he had the overwhelming impression that it was looking at him. He wrote, "I was not observing the field. The field was observing me." He left at 12:05 a.m., drove back to his hotel and told his assistant he would not return to the site after dark. That final note in his journal read, "Some histories are best left undisturbed." The Atlanta University study was published 2 years later. The Bogard material appeared only as an appendix, too strange, too uncertain for academic acceptance. Wilson retired soon after, but the story didn't end there. In 1968, a collection of items surfaced at an estate auction in New Orleans. Among them, a water-damaged leather journal with the initials EWB stamped on its cover. The handwriting matched that of Eleanora Whitmore Bogard. The first legible entry was dated November 26, 1852, 2 months after James's birth. "Thomas believes I do not notice his absence. He thinks I mourn it. How can I explain that his distance is a relief? He looks at James with fear. If he knew the truth, he would not fear but worship. His eyes grow brighter each day. They are beautiful beyond measure. Sarah avoids his gaze, but I see what waits beyond the eastern field. They watch through him. They wait for the tide." The following pages were nearly erased by water, but one line survived. "He spoke today." Not nonsense, a name, not one I can write. When he said it, I felt the water move inside me. "They are coming. I have already chosen." The last entry bore a single date, January 9, 1853, the night before the fire. "Thomas hides us here thinking he has escaped scandal. He does not understand. This was always where it would end. They will come with the midnight tide. The sea calls its own. I will go with them. Fear is only for those who have not yet seen." Dr. Wilson, then retired, authenticated the journal. It was genuine. The ink, the language, the paper, all mid-19th century. He called it a confession or perhaps an invitation. In 1972, marine archaeologists working off the coast near Brunswick discovered a circular depression on the seafloor, 50 feet wide and dropping into blackness. Sonar couldn't find the bottom. Divers reported hearing faint rhythmic sounds underwater, like a heartbeat or the pulse of distant machinery. One diver described seeing faint lights beneath the silt, as though the sea were watching us back. They abandoned the site after 2 divers surfaced vomiting seawater they had not swallowed. The area was labeled Natural Anomaly. Vessel caution advised. Dr. Wilson died in 1974, but before he did, he sent a final note to the Historical Society that read, "The wall still stands." But for how long? And for decades it did. Through war storms and neglect, the stone barrier at Willow Creek remained untouched. Farmers sold their land. Families moved away. But every September under the full moon, someone, no one knew who, would arrive to inspect it. A truck, a lantern, a low voice counting stones. By 1986, the trust Thomas Bogard had created finally ran out of funds. The maintenance ended. No one came to check the wall again, and that's when the stories began. Residents near the old plantation claimed to hear water rushing underground during autumn nights, though no river ran through the fields. Hunters reported strange depressions in the soil shaped like scales or fins, and once a family driving down Route 19 said they saw lights drifting low over the trees. 3 perfect points, moving together in a slow, silent triangle. The county sheriff called it swamp gas. Locals called it something else. They called it the eyes of the deep ones. By the late 20th century, the Bogard case had been reduced to a regional ghost story, a plantation fire, a vanished mother. A child with strange eyes, nothing more than folklore told to frighten tourists driving through Calhoun County. But folklore has a way of waiting, just like the sea. It never dies. It just changes its shape. The forest had swallowed what was once Willow Creek Plantation. The grand house was gone, the cotton fields replaced by pines. Only the family cemetery survived, a cluster of crooked iron bars half buried in moss. The wall Thomas Bogard had ordered built was still there too, half collapsed but standing, as if it refused to forget. No one remembered who paid to repair it. The checks had stopped decades ago, yet somehow after every September storm the missing stones reappeared. No one saw who replaced them. But the wall never stayed broken for long. Then in 2004, the story surfaced again, not in a history journal, but in a laboratory. Tara Williams was a marine biology graduate student at the University of Georgia. Her research focused on genetic variations in fish populations along the coast, mutations linked to changing salinity levels and industrial runoff. But one batch of samples collected from the waters near Brunswick and Sapelo Island refused to behave normally. Under the microscope, their eyes shimmered with a reflective gold hue. And when she ran the DNA sequencing, she found something no database could categorize. A gene marker, unidentified, unregistered, impossible. A double helix with a third faint spiral wrapping through it, like a thread of light. The mutation affected the optic nerves, giving the fish vertical pupils and enhanced night vision, not unheard of, but unnatural for their species. Tara's notes described it as anomaly resembling cross-species coding with human-like sequences. Her advisor, Dr. Robert Chen, dismissed it as contamination. But privately he wrote in his correspondence, "My grandfather once told me about a boy born near the Georgia coast with eyes like a cat and skin that glowed underwater. He said our town called him the Sea Child. I thought it was nonsense. Now I'm not sure." Tara's paper was published quietly in a small academic journal. The results were extraordinary, but the conclusion was simple: unexplained genetic divergence, likely environmental. No one mentioned the Bogard name. No one dared to, but Dr. Chen knew. And in his private archive he wrote one last note. Science does not recognize inheritance of the ocean, but the ocean remembers everything. 2 decades later, during renovations of the Calhoun County Courthouse in 2011, workers discovered a sealed compartment behind the cornerstone. Inside was a collection of documents wrapped in oilcloth, the same kind once used to store medical records in the 1850s. One of them was signed by Dr. James Williams, the plantation physician who had attended Eleanora's birth. His words had been hidden for more than 150 years. The child exhibits several peculiarities beyond the eyes. Under dim light, his skin gives off a faint luminescence. Subtle webbing present between fingers, and when I examined the neck, I observed the beginning of gill-like structures beneath the jawline. When I touched these, the infant gripped my wrist with unnatural strength. I experienced a vivid vision of a dark shore, black sand, and figures moving in glowing water, their eyes identical to the child's. The vision ended when contact broke. I will never speak of this to anyone. I fear my own mind more than the truth I saw. The deposition ended there, signed and sealed. It had been placed into the courthouse wall months later, during a centennial ceremony, as if Dr. Williams wanted to hide his confession where only time could find it. When the document was authenticated, a ripple of quiet fascination ran through Georgia's academic circles. Some dismissed it as hysteria. Others wondered aloud whether this was the earliest recorded mention of what modern folklore called the Deep Ones, the people of the tide, said to live beneath the Atlantic shelf. But those who studied the Bogard family history saw something else, an unbroken pattern of sightings, sounds and strange births always aligned with the September full moon. In 2013, a small research team was granted permission to excavate the remains of the Brunswick property, the place where Eleanora and her child had disappeared into the fire and the sea. The house had long been reduced to sand and fragments, but beneath the foundation, they discovered something that shouldn't have been there at all. A perfect circle of stones buried deep in the earth, blackened but intact. The formation matched no known architecture of the 19th century. It was older, ancient, possibly indigenous, though none of the local tribes claimed it. In the center of the circle lay a cluster of small figurines carved from a dark, glossy stone, unlike anything found on land. Each figure was shaped like a human, yet not entirely. Limbs too long, eyes too wide, their faces smooth and eyeless, as though they had not yet decided how to look upon the world. One figurine was different. It showed a tall being carrying a smaller one in its arms, a mother and child or something older carrying something new. The carvings were sent to the University of Georgia for study. The lab results reported the stone's composition as volcanic glass of unknown marine origin, possibly deep ocean vent material. But the carvings were found 30 miles inland, beneath a house built in 1850. No official explanation was ever released. The findings vanished into academic storage, misfiled under unknown artifacts. By 2015, word of the excavation had reached beyond academia. A television production company specializing in paranormal history obtained access to the site. Intending to film an episode about southern hauntings, they arrived in September. During the full moon, their cameras failed the first night. Their audio equipment picked up rhythmic sounds like breathing, though no one heard it in real time. 3 crew members reported identical dreams of standing on a shoreline and seeing luminous figures rising from the waves. The producer later told an interviewer, "We've been to 100 so-called haunted places. You usually have to try to make them scary. But that place didn't want to be filmed. It wanted to be seen." The episode was never released. 2 years later, in 2017, a genealogical project mapping plantation families requested DNA samples from descendants of the Bogard line. Only one agreed: Richard Bogard, a 73-year-old retired naval engineer living in Portland, Oregon. The lab's results came back flagged with an alert: genetic divergence beyond known human variation. When the technician called to verify the data, Richard simply laughed. "There have always been stories in our family," he said, "about the boy who went into the sea and the mother who followed. My grandfather said we carry the ocean in our blood. I never believed him until I joined the Navy. 30 years at sea, and I never once felt seasick. Always felt like I was going home." 6 months later, Richard died in his sleep. His will contained one final request. His ashes were to be scattered 1 mile off the coast of Brunswick, exactly where the circular seafloor depression had been mapped in 1972. When the captain performing the ceremony poured the ashes into the tide, he reported something impossible. The water glowed where the ashes fell. Just for a moment, like it was welcoming them back. And then came the hurricane September 2019. A Category 3 storm made landfall on the Georgia coast and should have weakened inland. Instead, its path bent unnaturally westward, following a narrow corridor of destruction that led straight to Calhoun County, to the ruins of Willow Creek. Meteorologists called it an atmospheric anomaly. No one could explain why the winds intensified directly over the old plantation site. When it was over, the storm had left one unique mark. The Bogard Wall was gone. Not damaged, erased, pulverized. In its place lay hundreds of black stones scattered through the pine forest. Some were carved with figures identical to those found at Brunswick. Many were collected by locals as curiosities. One, however, was placed in the Calhoun County Historical Museum, where it still rests under glass. It depicts a tall figure with wide eyes and long hands, holding a child against its chest. The museum's curator wrote the caption himself, "Recovered from the site of the former Bogard Plantation, 2019. Material unknown. Symbolism undetermined, but locals know what it means. They know it's her, Eleanora Whitmore Bogard, the woman who walked into the sea. And they say that if you drive past the old plantation land during the September full moon, you can still hear the waves. Even though the ocean is more than 100 miles away, they say the tide is coming home." By 2020, the Bogard story had settled back into silence, the kind that hums beneath ordinary life. The hurricane was over. The wall was gone. The black carvings had become local folklore, scattered across mantles and roadside gift shops. To most, they were nothing more than strange relics of coincidence. But to a few, they were something else, markers. It started quietly. A handful of people across Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas began reporting the same recurring dream. Always the same scene, standing on a shoreline that glowed from beneath, hearing voices calling from the surf, not in words but in rhythm. Some described it as music, others said it was breathing. One woman in Savannah claimed she woke up drenched in seawater, though her bed was dry seconds later. Local news called it mass suggestion brought on by stress and post-hurricane trauma. Psychologists blamed the collective anxiety of the times. But a retired marine biologist named Dr. Tara Williams, now in her 50s, recognized something in the reports that pulled at her memory. She reopened her old genetic data from 2004, the fish samples she'd once written off as contamination. When she reanalyzed them with modern software, the truth became impossible to ignore. The anomaly, the mysterious triple helix structure, wasn't limited to marine life anymore. It was appearing in human DNA databases, unpublished, unacknowledged, hidden in raw data across continents. Not mutations, not disease, inheritance. She spent months tracing the origin of the earliest samples, following genealogical paths and overlapping migration routes. Every line, every branch, every unexplained case of aberrant ocular pigmentation or unknown hereditary marker curved back toward one place, the Georgia coast. Specifically Calhoun County, Willow Creek. In an email to a colleague she trusted, Dr. Williams wrote, "If this is real, and it is, then whatever happened in 1853 didn't end. It adapted." "It bred," the colleague never replied. 3 days later, Williams vanished. Her apartment door was unlocked, her computer wiped, her car still in the parking lot. The only thing missing was a small carved stone from her desk, a black figure with long arms and hollow eyes. Around the same time, a young journalist named Eleanor Morris began investigating the same coastal anomalies. Her grandmother had grown up in Calhoun County, and she'd always told stories about the sea people, stories the family laughed off as superstition. But Eleanor's son, born in 2018, had the same amber eyes described in those stories. His pupils would narrow to slits when he looked at sunlight. Doctors said it was a congenital optical mutation, but Eleanor knew better. She found old newspaper clippings, letters, and copies of Dr. Wilson's unpublished appendix. When she laid them out chronologically on her wall, she saw the pattern clearly, like a tide moving forward every century. 1853, 1961, 2004, 2019 each generation closer. She drove to Calhoun County in September 2021. The forest that had replaced the plantation was quiet, too quiet. The air hung heavy with that same metallic scent the locals still called sea rust. The foundation stones of Willow Creek were buried under roots, but the earth above them was wet. When she dug into it with her hands, brackish water welled up between her fingers. That night she stayed in the only motel for miles. The power flickered at midnight. When she looked out the window, she saw movement among the pines, faint lights gliding between the trees. 3 of them, always in a triangle. At 2:17 a.m., she began hearing a sound from somewhere beyond the forest. Not wind, not thunder. It was humming. The next morning, she found herself at the county museum. The curator, an old man named Calder, showed her the black carving recovered after the hurricane. He said quietly, "It's heavier than it looks." Some nights it hums. When Eleanor pressed her palm against the glass, the hum stopped, and the air around her shifted, as though the room itself had drawn breath. She left the museum shaken but compelled. On her drive back through the county road, she passed the old wall site. There was nothing left but scattered stones and wild grass. But when she slowed the car, she saw that the ground was darker in one section, wet even though the day was dry. A single pool of brackish water shimmered in the sunlight. At its center lay a small, pale handprint. Weeks later, a fisherman near Sapelo Island found a woman's car abandoned by the shore. Her phone and recorder were still inside. The last file time-stamped 11:58 p.m. The recording was never made public, but a partial transcript circulated among archivists. "I can hear them. They're close now. The water. It's moving even though the tide is out. There are lights under it, shapes. I think they know I'm here. I think they always knew. I can see. I can see eyes. Oh God, they're not." The tape ends with a sound like waves crashing, though the sea was calm that night. In 2022, genetic testing companies began, reporting a sudden increase in sequencing errors specific to users. Along the southern coast of the US, a leaked memo from one lab mentioned non-human code patterns contaminating coastal samples. The data was suppressed within weeks, but a private researcher released a map and unverified, quickly removed from the internet. It showed clusters of people across 3 states with a shared genetic marker. The pattern traced an ancient shape, a crescent bending inward like a wave, at its center, Calhoun County. Locals say that since 2019, the forest has begun to change. Small pools appear after rainfall and never dry. Certain trees lean east, their roots reaching toward the direction of the old wall. And at night there are sounds, low, rhythmic and wet, like the sea breathing beneath the soil. Hunters claim to have found scales half the size of a man's hand, embedded in the bark of pines. Others whisper of pale figures glimpsed between trees, moving with the slow grace of swimmers. When the full moon rises in September, the air grows heavy and the insects stop singing. The silence becomes absolute. Then from somewhere beyond the tree line, the humming begins again. 3 notes, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Those who hear it say it feels less like a sound and more like a memory returning. The Bogard bloodline never ended. It dispersed, through time, through families, through water and bone, and somewhere along the coast, those with amber eyes are beginning to dream again. They dream of light beneath the waves. They dream of a voice calling from the deep. They dream of a wall that was supposed to keep the sea out, and failed. The tide is coming back, and this time it remembers every name. By the autumn of 2023, the humming had spread, not just in Calhoun County, not just along the Georgia coast. Reports began surfacing from as far as Maine and the Gulf of Mexico, people hearing that same low vibration through their walls at night. 3 tones, soft as breath, echoing like memory through steel, glass, and seawater. At first it was dismissed as tinnitus, or underground construction, or the wind moving through foundation pipes. But recordings began to appear online. Thousands of them, from phones, car dashboards, basement vents. The frequencies matched. 22 hertz, too low for the human ear to consciously register, but strong enough to cause nausea, fear, and vivid dreams. The dreams were always the same, a black horizon. A white light flickering beneath the waves. And a voice whispering, "Come home." Within months, the government issued quiet advisories about subsonic oceanic anomalies. Navy sonar operators were ordered not to record below 40 hertz. Satellite imaging near the Georgia coast showed spirals of bioluminescent bloom extending miles offshore, forming perfect geometric shapes, visible only from the air. They didn't last. They would glow for a few hours, then vanish. But in the center of those spirals, researchers noticed something else. Movement. Not fish, not whales. Something larger rising from the dark, then sinking again before sonar could lock on. In December of that year, an investigative journalist named Cole Whitman, a descendant of the Whitmore family by marriage, contacted the Georgia Historical Society requesting access to restricted files on Willow Creek and the Bogard Trust. He claimed to be researching a documentary called The Ones Beneath. He never submitted the final cut, but fragments of his footage were recovered months later from a hard drive washed up 30 miles inland after a flood. What survived was grainy, handheld, distorted by water damage. The first clip showed Cole walking through the ruins of Willow Creek, narrating into his camera, "The ground is still wet here, even in drought. Locals say the soil never dries because the sea doesn't let go of what it's claimed." The second clip, time-stamped 2:43 a.m., showed a dense fog rising between the trees. In the background you could hear humming, low, layered, almost harmonic. Cole's voice trembled. "It's not in the distance. It's under me. The ground's vibrating. Jesus Christ. I think it's the same sound from the recordings." Then the camera turned sharply downward. The lens caught something, ripples spreading in the soil as if water moved beneath it. "There's something glowing under the ground." The footage ended there. The authorities found his car a mile away, headlights still on, doors open. No sign of him. The soil near the site was saturated with brackish water, even though there'd been no rain for weeks. By early 2024, the phenomenon had spread too far to contain. A string of inexplicable events occurred across the southeastern states. divers reported structures on the ocean floor resembling walls and corridors. Entire schools of fish washed ashore with eyes turned amber before death. And in Savannah, a baby was born with webbing between its fingers. Hospitals listed it as a genetic deformity. The mother, when interviewed, said softly, "He doesn't blink when he looks at the ocean. He smiles." In February, a leaked memo from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, revealed internal debate about unidentified organic activity beneath the Atlantic thermocline. One line stood out. The Bogard pattern is no longer confined to genealogy. It's ecological. For years, scientists had dismissed the old journals as myth, but the pattern was repeating itself, not through bloodlines alone, but through water. The mutation was propagating outward, carried by the sea, rewriting everything it touched. One coastal scientist described it simply, "It's not spreading like a virus, it's awakening." Meanwhile, inland communities began to change in subtler ways. In Calhoun County, the lakes deepened. Wells flooded without rain. The groundwater began to taste faintly of salt. Those who drank from it reported dreams that felt shared, entire neighborhoods dreaming the same scenes on the same nights. Children in local schools began sketching the same image during art class, a tall, faceless figure holding a smaller one beneath a black sun. Teachers dismissed it as viral media influence until one child was asked what it meant. She said, "It's the mother and the boy. They're waiting for the rest." The next day, the child vanished. Her parents found only her shoes by the backyard pond. The water was glowing. Satellite data over the next months showed faint bioluminescent veins creeping inland through river systems, tracing the exact course of America's old waterways, the same routes once used for trade, for transport, for slavery. It was as if the ocean was reclaiming its forgotten roads, taking back what had been dragged from it centuries before, and as it moved, so did the sound. People hundreds of miles from the coast began to hear it in their walls, in the plumbing, in the hum of distant power lines, that same three-note rhythm. At first, scientists called it the Brunswick Resonance. Online, it had another name, the Call of Eleanora. In August, an anonymous video was uploaded to an encrypted forum. It showed a woman standing knee-deep in water, somewhere on a flooded Georgia road. She held her phone out, trembling, and whispered, "It's not rainwater. It's coming up from the ground. It's warm. It's humming." The camera tilted down to show the water at her feet glowing faintly blue. Then she turned it upward toward the dark horizon. For a fraction of a second, something vast moved beneath the surface, eyes like molten gold breaking through the reflection before sinking back into silence. The clip ended with her whispering, "They're here." Her account was deleted within hours. By autumn of 2024, entire coastal towns had evacuated. Salt water crept up highways, swallowed marshland, drowned forests that had never seen tides before. The official explanation blamed groundwater rise due to tectonic shifts, but those who lived there knew better. Because in Calhoun County, at the exact site where the Bogard Wall once stood, the water finally broke the surface. It bubbled up through the soil in a slow, steady rhythm, 3 pulses at a time. Then, on the night of the September full moon, the ground opened like a mouth. Witnesses claimed they saw light beneath the earth, not fire, not electricity, but the same luminous shimmer seen in the ocean depths. Some said they saw figures within it. Others said they heard voices calling their names. When morning came, the forest was gone. The land had sunk by 6 feet, leaving behind a shallow, still pool. The soil around it was coated in black glass. The state declared it a geological collapse. But those who stood near the edge said the air smelled of salt, and if you listened closely, you could hear the sound again, faint, rhythmic, like something breathing, like something waiting. They say the sea forgets nothing. Every tide that withdraws carries the memory of what it once touched. Every name, every whisper, every unfinished promise, and somewhere, beneath what was once Willow Creek, that memory began to rise. The land had become unstable for miles. Roots rotted from beneath. The pine forest that replaced the cotton fields stood half drowned in brackish water. Locals who dared to wander near the sinkhole spoke of seeing lights flickering below the surface. Not reflections, but movement. Like lanterns drifting through a submerged city. The old families who still lived in Calhoun County packed their belongings and left without waiting for government orders. They said the ground hummed at night now, and that if you stayed long enough, you could feel it under your skin and slow and steady, like a heartbeat trying to sync with your own. But a few stayed behind. Among them was an old caretaker named Reed, who had once worked on the property before the hurricane. He told anyone who would listen that the sea was reclaiming its blood. That Eleanora's choice hadn't been madness, it had been prophecy. She opened the way, he said. She never died. She just went home. No one believed him. But when Reed disappeared one evening, his house left empty. The only thing the sheriff found was a line of wet footprints leading out the back door. Barefoot, human-sized and ending at the water's edge, the prints didn't come back. As the weeks passed, strange phenomena spread through the region. Wells turned saline overnight. Birds refused to cross certain patches of air. Insects vanished entirely. And in the small towns near the coast, more children were born with eyes that shimmered gold in sunlight. The midwives began marking those births quietly, recording them under false names, whispering prayers they didn't understand. Some of the children didn't cry at all. They only stared toward the horizon, as if waiting for something that hadn't yet arrived. Scholars who still studied the Bogard case began to notice an unexplainable detail. Across old maps of Calhoun County, rivers and creeks seemed to have shifted course over the decades, forming an unmistakable pattern when traced from above, a vast spiral widening outward, its center exactly where Willow Creek once stood. Inside that spiral, compasses failed. Electronic devices drained in seconds. The air held a faint tang of salt, even on windless days. Locals called it the Deep Eye. Some said it wasn't a place but a presence, something vast and patient, turning slowly beneath the land. Others said it was Eleanora herself, watching through the water, waiting for her descendants to return to her call. One autumn night, a small team of university researchers ventured into the area to collect soil samples. Their names were never published, only their field notes. The last entry reads, "The ground is breathing." Not metaphorically, it's expanding and contracting as though the water below is alive. The vibrations match the recorded frequencies from the Brunswick anomaly. 22 hertz repeating in triplets. The sound, it's not coming from below, it's coming through. Their camp was found the next morning, tents flattened, equipment scattered, and every trace of human presence washed clean, as though the rain had scoured the earth. But there had been no rain that night. The only thing left behind was a spiral drawn into the mud with a single finger. A month later, fishermen off the coast reported seeing what they described as columns of light rising from the ocean floor, silent, pale, and impossibly straight. They extended hundreds of feet into the night sky before fading. The Coast Guard dismissed the reports as atmospheric refraction, but satellite images captured that same night showed a glowing shape beneath the water, 3 points forming a triangle, the same formation, described by the lighthouse keeper in 1853. Those who still tell the story say that on certain nights when the moon is full, the waters along the Georgia coast become glass smooth, and if you stand perfectly still at the shoreline, you can hear a woman's voice singing bar low, wordless, almost tender. She sings not to the living, but to those still trapped, to those who have the eyes of the deep, to those who remember her blood. Some swear that if you answer her song even in a whisper, the tide will rise higher, around your feet than the rest of the shore, that if you stay it will rise again and again, until the sea takes you gently by the hand. No struggle, no pain, just a return. The wall is gone, the boundaries are gone. What Thomas Bogard feared most, the merging of two worlds, is no longer prophecy. It is memory becoming present. The deep no longer needs to send watchers to the fields. The watchers are already here, born under new names, living among us, waiting for the signal that will call them home. And when it comes, it won't be with thunder or storms or fire. It will come as a vibration in the bones, a taste of salt on the tongue, and a song you realize you've known your entire life. The last surviving record connected to the Bogard case rests now in the archives of the Atlanta Historical Institute, a faded page believed to be written in Eleanora's own hand. Though no one can confirm its origin, it reads, "The sea does not take what it loves, it remembers, And when the remembering is complete, it comes to gather its children. Even now, they say, when the full moon bleeds silver over the drowned fields of Calhoun County, the water glows softly, and if you look long enough, you'll see her, a woman standing waist-deep in the tide, cradling a child whose eyes burn gold in the dark, watching, waiting, until the tide rises again.